Hello, Dieter.
Hello, good to see you again, and thanks for
Yeah,
having me
no,
here.
this is it's been fun doing this with you. Of course, we started I don't know year and a half ago, and to say the least, I've learned a lot about FinOps. Actually, more than I learned from the certification exam from you, right? And working with you.
I'm not
So it's
going to
always a
comment on
pleasure to
that.
have you here. Yeah. It's for the audience who don't know Dieter, which is probably not the case. Most of have heard Dieter. He's a FinOps ambassador. He leads the FinOps practice at Roku. He has worked with for Google, Intuit, you name it. But he's also very generous with his time and educating the FinOps community, especially how to be like best in class, right? Because the organization he runs at Roku is best in class. We have like 600 some customers at FinOps, and I can I can easily say Roku is our the best customer, right? He's elite of the elite. So he has given us a pleasure, is generous enough to share his time and thoughts on the topic, which we've been hearing lately quite a bit, right? I'm doing good. I don't need to do any more commitment management. I'm at 70% coverage or 80% coverage. So, according to Dieter, and Dieter, you want to say a few things there before we kind of dive into it?
No,
But I've been
I
hearing
mean,
this from a lot of engineers and a lot of teams. Like, why should
I
we do
hear that a
anything?
lot, right? Where people say like, "Oh, we have like 60%, 80%, even 90% coverage, right?"
Yep.
And we are good, we are doing well. Especially when you ask engineers, right? They pride themselves on that achievement, right? We have like 90% commitment coverage. And so that is a common story. And today I want to talk a little bit about why I think that is not the right approach.
So before we dive in, I think just a couple of housekeeping rules, right? Please have your questions at the very end. This is a very interactive session, so less of me talking or doing any slides. It's more about Dieter sharing his wisdom, right? So let's dive into this. So why do you think why do engineers and FinOps team they are like, yeah, this is good enough. It's good enough. Why do you think that doesn't work? What are your thoughts? You said you had some, beyond just FinOps, you had some thoughts about this
Yes,
psychological factors.
absolutely. And again, thanks for giving me the time to talk about that, right? I thought deeply about this, right? And when we look at the good enough approach, that is something that works well in our private lives often, right? For example, when you look at your most recent partner and when you just met, there were upsides, right? And there were also downsides. But because I mentioned it is your most recent partner, you guys are still together, so you decided that the upsides outweigh the downsides, hopefully, right? So that works in our private lives very well. Another example is college grads that are starting a household, right? They have to make a couple of critical purchases like furniture and appliances and those kind of things, right? And they understand that those are big dollar items and they want their funds are limited, right? They don't want to make a mispurchase, right? So they can be sort of trapped in that decision paralysis where they try to figure out what is the best thing instead of using that good enough approach and going with an intermediate solution and then upgrading from that, right? So that works. It's a principle that works really well in our private lives, right? Um, when we now go into our professional lives, many times that principle applies as well, right? So it carries over. That is what I'm trying to
Yep.
say. That, for example, I worked with a team that spends 10 to 20 hours a week adjusting PowerPoint slides, right? They look at the bars of a graph, right, and they adjust the width of the bars, the number on the graph, they adjust the font color, the font size, those kind of things, right? And when I take a step back and think about how executives or leadership in general looks at these types of situations, they want to see the data and they want to hear about your business case, right? So the how good the graphics really look like is not really a factor when leadership makes their decisions, right? So that good enough approach applies also in your professional life, right? How much time do you want to spend on massaging an email before you send it out, right? Maybe 5-10 minutes is a good amount of time, right? But something beyond that, you may be overthinking it, right? So that good enough approach is something that helps us through our lives, right? Private and professional, and is something that applies on both sides of our lives. Now, I think maybe we can go to the next slide. Let's see what that one says.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this is like commitment management scenario, right? Like
yeah,
good
exactly.
enough.
So when
Yeah.
it comes to commitment management, and commitment management is part of rate optimization, the FinOps capability called rate optimization. So that is something that FinOps practitioners are aware of, right? And need to perform and need to be good at, right? When we now look at commitment management, and this is the title of this presentation or of this webinar, is 98% commitment coverage the new norm, right?
Yep.
But let's take a step back and look at commitment management, right? When you talk to FinOps practitioners and you ask them, we have different types of commitments in the cloud, things like reserved instances, savings plans. On the GCP side, we have resource-based and
Good.
flexible committed use discounts. On the Azure side, we have reservations, right? And there's over 100 products that offer reservations on the Azure side. So when we look at commitment management and you ask a FinOps practitioner, in which order are those commitments applied? They, may take like a good minute, but they will be able to come up with an answer. Now, if you ask even seasoned FinOps practitioners, like 8+ years of experience, and under what circumstances does this order change? I am willing to say that the majority of FinOps practitioners are not even aware that the order of in which the commitments are being applied can change, right? And that is the vast majority of even seasoned practitioners don't know the answer to that, which tells me there is a knowledge gap, right? There is maybe training is required, those kind of things. And what do people do when they are facing something that is uncertain, right? They apply these methods that work outside of the commitment management area on commitment management. Now, when we look at commitment management itself, I checked this morning. Google says that AWS has 39 regions with a total of 123 availability zones. So you have the regions, you have the availability zones, right? You have the VM types, and there's
Yep.
hundreds, if not thousands, of VM types.
Yeah.
There's the VM sizes, right? Is it a M5 XL, M5
Large.
2XL, right, and so forth. Then you have the network configuration. Is it classic or is it VPC? A lot of even seasoned FinOps practitioners may not even know about that. You have the tenancy. That is also something that people forget. It's dedicated or shared. And of course, you have the operating system. So you get this problem space of over 4 million stock keeping units, right? And these stock keeping units have to be adjusted on an hourly basis. And that makes the problem difficult for people, right? If you think about you have maybe a spreadsheet with 4 million rows. I don't know if that's something that Excel can handle, right? Maybe you need like a special laptop with a lot of memory that can you look at this problem, right? But it is admittedly so a large problem space, right? Now, when we go to the next slide, what do we have there?
Yeah. So essentially, you're saying there's just so many millions of permutations and combinations, and it's
Yes,
very hard for even a spreadsheet to do this, let alone the human, right? Human
yes.
has its own limitations. Yeah.
So when we now look at that, right, how do people approach this problem, right? And this is why you should not settle for good enough, right? Fundamentally, the commitment coverage is a mathematical problem that can be solved perfectly in every given hour. And that is something I think where the confusion arises, right? We essentially have something 2 + 2 = 4, and we have FinOps practitioners and engineers or leadership that go and solve it by 2 + 2 = 5 ± 2, right? This is not how you approach this problem. It is a mathematical problem that an algorithm can perfectly solve, right? Essentially, you have a riddle that has a single answer, and you're providing some other answer to avoid solving the riddle, right? And that is understandable because it is a complex problem. It is too much for a human being to do. Especially, you need to handle those 4 million SKUs every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? A human cannot do that, but an algorithm can find the perfect solution in any given hour to solve that problem. And I think this is fundamentally where that disconnect is, right? We apply a human methodology that helps us through life, right, to a mathematical problem, right? It doesn't need the good enough approach. It can be solved perfectly, not by people, but by algorithms.
So just to summarize, you think this is a computational problem, not
Yes,
something that the human life situation, they are more qualitative and things like that, where you hard to apply a mathematical formula or something like that, right? And then the emotionals are involved. Here you think it's a perfect equation, but a lot of different combination makes it difficult for a human, even for a spreadsheet, to come up with the optimal answer. And that's
exactly.
why you started out with like, hey, why we do this, but this is not the right approach in this case because it's a
It
it's a
is not.
mathematical competition. Okay.
Yeah, it is absolutely not, right? Someone is asking you the answer to a riddle, and you avoid the answer by giving a different answer, essentially, right? That is fundamentally what I think is going on here, right? That we have that the good enough, the satisfactory solution to many of life's problems, private and professional, right? And we apply it to something that is a computational problem that can be perfectly solved by algorithms, not by humans. But because this is complex, right, we still apply it and we still feel comfortable about it.
So so how do you know, right? Like, and this has been, people say throw out numbers and stuff, and it's mainly the coverage they would say, right? But they never get into the ESR, which is kind of a good term to evaluate if you're doing good,
Mhm.
better, or best, right? So how do you, what is your recommend? That's kind of the next question, right? Like, how do you
Yes.
know where you are and how can you do better?
So let's do actually a self-test, right? That you can do in a sense from your laptop for your own organization, right? And that self-test, you simply go and you look at your compute spend and you graph it, but this time not on a monthly or daily basis, you graph it on an hourly basis, right? And you group by the purchase option. So here you will see the purchase option of the, let's say, savings plans or flexible committed use discounts, the purchase option of the reserved instances or the resource-based committed use discounts, and then you will see your on-demand spend. Typically, these cloud providers allow you to look at about 48 hours of data, right? Something like that. So you will have 48 bars, and your on-demand spend should essentially completely vanish on some of these bars, not on all of them, right? You will have daily fluctuations.
So you have
So
48 bars and then you shouldn't see any or hardly any on demand in those bars. Is
for
that what you're
some
saying?
of the bars,
So,
right? Not all of them, but some of the bars, your on-demand spend should completely vanish, right? Maybe you have like a pixel or something like that. It can hardly render, right? But if you see that you have reasonably chunks, right? Something like 4, 5, 8 pixels or even more, at best on that graph, you are having a problem, right? You can do better than you're currently doing. So that is a simple test that anyone can run, maybe even someone that if you don't have access, you can ask someone else for that. Hey, give me that 48-hour compute breakdown by purchase option, and then you take a look at the graph and see if your on-demand is persistent, right? It doesn't want to go away, or if your on-demand actually completely vanishes. For us, there are hours where the on-demand is completely gone, right? So I know that we are performing well. But that's not the only thing that you can do, right? Because you can, and maybe that will be on the next slide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the
So you can actually reach out there. FinOps is just one of the companies, right, that provide an automated commitment management solution. And again, there are way more companies that provide manual commitment management,
yeah.
right? Just because it's easier to have staff either in the US or abroad, right? You have like 40, 50 technicians that go and look at that for every customer on a daily basis, right? And they make adjustments. However, there are a couple of disadvantages of a manual system, right? And manual could be also you guys doing that in-house, right? First of all, you can't optimize every hour. That's the most critical one, right? How often are you going to make adjustments? Once a week, maybe once or twice a month, something like that, right?
Very
The
resource
other,
intensive, and yeah, not, it's
it
a
is very
computational
resource
problem you're
because
trying
you
to
still
solve.
have that 4 million SKU problem, right? So it is very resource intensive, but with tooling, you could potentially do that in-house. And there's many companies that have manual systems that offer that service manually, right? But again, it cannot be done at the same frequency that a fully automated solution performs, right? The next one is human error, right? You have Bob come in on Monday and go through their customers, right? And his wife told him on Friday that she is filing for divorce. So Bob's mind will not be in the game on Monday and possibly for the rest of the week, right? So, and human errors can have a substantial effect. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in just a couple of weeks, right? When you look at commitment management, it is actually the single largest thing that you can do to save money in the cloud, right? Let's go just with a very simple, small example. You have a small business that maybe spends $10 million in the cloud, and 20% of your spend is on compute, which is a typical number, right? So 20% would be 2 million annually, right? These commitment products that the cloud providers offer give you between 30 and 50% discounts, depending if you do 1 year or 3 year commitments, right? So a 50% discount gives you a cool $1 million annual savings, right? So 1 million is probably more than you're making, right? So it is a very good leverage for your company to employ you, and you give them that $1 million in savings. And these savings scale up, right? If you, in this example, I used you spending 10 million on cloud annually. What if you're spending 20, 40, 80, 100 million, right? The savings will get larger and larger, but that also means that making even small mistakes um, will have a larger impact on the
Scale effect.
loss of savings, right? And so I have seen, if someone makes a mistake where they buy reserved instances for something that is already covered by savings plans, that you can rack up a couple $100,000 in just a few weeks of lost savings, right? So doing that manually, either in-house or with a vendor that does it manually, is not recommended for these reasons, right? And the vendors that use a fully automated approach, there are a couple of these vendors, right? The advantages are here that the automated system, if it makes a mistake, that mistake is called a bug, right? Algorithms have bugs.
Yeah.
And the engineers will eventually find that this bug is surfacing over and over again, right? And they will be able to squash the bug or remediate the problem, strengthening the algorithm over time, right? And also the automated system is the only one that doesn't have human error in it, right? And it can perform on an hourly basis. So it can provide that perfect answer to 2 plus 2 equals 4 every given hour, and which results in higher savings by itself, right? So any questions from your side around that?
Yes, so you bring up a good point, right? At NOps, this is our bread and butter, right? So if we had a bug and we have hundreds of customers, obviously that's on our radar to fix it, right? And we can
Yes,
see these patterns across all this customer, and especially since we only get paid based on share of savings, so we are
yeah,
incentivized to deliver the most savings, right? And an algorithm, fixing algorithm once can give you that 600, 500 times multiple for NOps, right? And
yes,
that is a very good incentive for us to, and also we want to shine against the competition, right? So we
exactly.
want to earn your business and keep your business, right? So
And actually,
good
let's
point.
talk about that. Let's do a click down into that, right?
Yeah.
How you outperform your competition, because I think any of these customers, they offer a free savings, of these vendors offer a
Yep.
free savings analysis, right? So you can do a free savings analysis and see how much more this fully automated system can actually save you, right? Here we have a EC2 coverage graph, and that is for my current organization. And I added the filters on the right-hand side so that you can actually see that this is for EC2 only, right? We don't consider RDS or Lambda or any of these other products, right? This is an EC2 only coverage graph. And you see here that in the beginning of the graph, this is where we started to use a vendor other than FinOps, right? These vendors are relatively interchangeable, right? All you need is certain types of permissions, which is identity and access management permissions. And for the savings analysis, you can give read-only permissions.
Read only.
And then if you decide to move forward, you elevate the read-only permissions to read-write permissions, right? Activating that vendor, and so that the vendor can perform on your behalf, right? So we see here that sort of like in the first third of the graph, right? The previous vendor is performing quite well, but then we see a markable drop in the EC2 coverage. And remember what I said before, right? That when you look at your 48-hour resolution, the on-demand spend should occasionally vanish for certain hours, right? It may not be able to vanish completely for every single hour, but at least there should be some examples where you almost have no on-demand spend, right? So that was certainly the case in the beginning of this engagement with another vendor. However, after I call it the honeymoon period, which is like 3-4 months, you see that the coverage drops, right? So I reached out to that vendor and I asked, what is going on, what is happening here, and I really couldn't get a good answer. Now, over the course of the next 2 months, that graph is trending up a little bit. So I was hoping that maybe this was just a temporary fluke, right? And the graph eventually will recover. But then when we look towards the second half of that graph,
Yep.
right, it sort of really never fully recovered, right? And I'm still having conversations with that vendor, trying to figure out what was going on here. But then at the very right hand side of the graph, we do see that the coverage is further degrading quite
Yep.
substantially. And this is where we gave notice to the previous vendor and said that we are going to switch to another vendor, right? And so that graph is further degrading in the coverage metric, right? When you look at those types of metrics, right, it is also important to note that you also look at utilization metrics, right? We don't have any graphs to show here, but any vendor can buy like $100 million of RIs, and then your savings plan utilization will drop to like 0%, right? So you need to make sure that the products are actually utilized 100%. So a good KPI here is for savings plan utilization should be close to 100%. RI utilization should be close to 100%. And then you can use this coverage graph here to measure the performance of the vendor, right? And then once we go to the next slide, we actually see the comparison, right? Here is a effective savings rate that is being shown, right? And on AWS, the effective savings rate, it will depend on your enterprise discount program and lots of different things, but overall, the 3-year effective savings rate is 54%. So that is the maximum achievable.
Max.
So when you look closely at the graph, right, you see that the previous vendor actually never reached the 54%. And then the month prior to where we give notice that we're going to switch vendors, that effective savings rate substantially drops. Then that's the red bars on the graph, right? And I didn't spend any time massaging this, by the way, and making sure that everything looks beautiful. Now, when FinOps took over from the previous vendor, FinOps was immediately able to outperform and continuously increased their performance to that theoretical maximum of 54%, right? The reason it takes some time is that the algorithm is using something called seeds. Those are specific RIs that the algorithm recognizes as their own, and it works off those RIs to perform on an hourly basis, right? But in this case, FinOps had to take over the seeds from a previous vendor, so the seeds were not really aligned with what the algorithm is expected. And so the algorithm had to work with that existing inventory and improve over time. So that is what we see in this graph. So again, takeaway from that is you can do a self-test, right? Look at a 48-hour resolution, see if your on-demand spend vanishes. You can reach out to one of those vendors and do a savings analysis, right? For free, by the way. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Don't worry about it then, right?
Yep.
But if the savings analysis shows additional savings, do consider a fully automated system, because automation is the only approach that can solve this equation every given hour. And we already established that this is too overwhelming for people to handle, and people tend to approach it with that good enough paradigm, right? And call it a day, because there's another human psychology that is playing a role here, which is my salary is the same, right?
Yeah.
No matter if I save the company $2 or $20 million, right? For the most part, my salary stays the same. But if I make a mistake, right, and that costs us $2 million, I could lose my job, right?
Yes, the
So
fear factor, right? Like, if I
yes,
screw up.
exactly.
Yeah.
So any of these systems you can run unintrusively first in an analysis mode, right? And then if you are convinced, you can run it for a couple of months, right? If you're convinced that this will perform better, you can then go and switch to a fully automated read-write mode, right, where that system is actually making those adjustments for you and helping you realize those savings.
No, that's wonderful. Like you said, we do pre-savings analysis, and then you decide, right? Like whether you want to proceed or not. Each
Yeah,
case is a little bit different. Your usage patterns are different, but especially
exactly.
if you have a substantial spend, it's worthwhile to do this. And it's a read-only permission, right? We are not taking over.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
and actually, if you have some concerns, you can also provide a copy of the cost and usage report to the vendor,
Yep.
right? They don't need actual access to your account.
Yep.
If you just provide the cost and usage report, anyway, as an S3 bucket is probably the easiest, right? Because you can very much isolate access to that S3 bucket. But if your security requirements are even higher, you could provide the cost and usage report over an FTP server where you have full control over,
Yeah.
right? And these vendors are able to run the savings analysis on that file essentially without needing access to your actually cost and usage data.
Okay, this is wonderful. I think we still have a few minutes we're
What
almost
other
at the
slides do we
time, but
have? Oh,
yeah,
Q&A. All right, let's do that.
yeah, we are almost at the time, but let's see if we have any questions, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think to kind of summarize, like, hey, this is a problem that has a lot of permutations and combination. It's humanly not impossible. And if you try to build your own, it takes time, effort, dedicated, skill set. And it's up to you whether you want to build it or buy it. And while vendor is not charging you, it's only charging you share of savings. It's worthwhile to do the free savings analysis, and then you decide, right?
Let's
This,
actually
I
do a
think,
click down on what it would take to build this in-house. Let's
yeah,
pretend that's a
yeah,
question,
you explore that.
and
So
let's
you've
do
been
that,
around.
right?
You've done
So
this
I
many
think,
times over.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think you will need at least 3 engineers, right? One can be out on vacation. The second one gets sick. You still have one engineer to support the system that you're going to build, right? In that environment, you have race conditions. So a race condition is something like, let's say you look at your bank account, you have $20 in the bank account, and now you are preparing a transfer to someone else, right? And then the transfer gives you an error message and says you don't have enough money. You look at your bank account, some other transfer happened between the two times where you looked, right? That is called a race condition.
yeah,
And so these engineers need to be able to handle race conditions, right? So you can't do junior engineers. They have to be fairly highly skilled, right? So fully loaded with medical and benefits and that kind of stuff, right? We are probably looking at 250,000 per engineer per year, right? So we are already at 750,000. Then you need to solve that 4 million SKU problem every given hour. So that means that your hardware has to essentially run 24/7, right? This is not something that you can do on containers
yeah,
and call it a day, right? And that hardware has to be fairly beefy. I mentioned you need the region, the zone, the type, the size, the amount of VMs, the operating system, the tenancy, the network. That is a fairly large memory machine that you need, right? In addition, all these cloud APIs, you can't just send 1,000 requests per second, right? They have something called an exponential backoff. So that means that you need to have a data collector that is then putting that data into a database, right? It's basically a continuous trickle of data into that database. However, the database is too slow to perform that computation. So you need a cache on top of that database, right? Um, and then you have your actual beefy compute instance, right, that is solving this problem on an hourly basis. So we are looking around $17 to $18 per hour on infrastructure that you need to run this, right? Which when you multiply that times 24 times 365, you get something in the order of magnitude of 150,000 annually, right? Plus your 3 engineers gives you 900,000 to build that system in-house. That said, it will take you 3 to 9 months to build that system, right? And it will take you another 18 months to work out the kinks, those race conditions that I mentioned earlier, right? So for the better part of 2 years, it will take you to build such a system in-house and not have to pay the vendor. That said, it is my belief that the vendor is charging substantially less than 900,000 annually, right, for this service, depending on your cloud footprint, the size of your cloud footprint.
yeah.
So just to give you an idea of what it takes to build this in-house.
No, that's excellent, right? I think we many times misjudge what it would take to do this in-house, right? And all the dependencies you have, human
Yes.
dependencies, computational dependencies. Okay, I think we are a little bit 5 minutes over. Uh, yeah,
Was it
let's
supposed to be 30 minutes or 45?
yeah, 30 minutes. Yeah.
30 minutes? All
Yeah.
right. Well,
Yep.
thank you for
Yep.
giving me the opportunity to talk about this, right? Um, I thought about that good enough last night, right? And I was trying to figure out, why do people use this good enough approach,
No, I've
right?
heard
Why?
it so many times. Like,
Yeah,
and one of the things I've heard is, nobody knows. We can do better. That's another reason people don't.
yeah,
It's like this is an additional burden if I want to carry fear.
yeah.
But yeah, it's. But at the same time, you can, if you have a good enough, substantial spend, even at 1 point increase could be a meaningful savings
Yes, I mean,
on
for
what you call.
us, just switching between the two vendors, you saw that one graph, okay, one
Yep.
graph was kind of going down, right? Because we gave notice, so I don't know what happened on the vendor side, but then the other graph was going up, right? In just a 4 month time period, right? The new vendor was able to save us an additional 250,000, right? So over a year, over the 12 months of a year, right, we're looking at 750,000 in additional savings, right?
Wow.
Just that, because that algorithm works better, right? And that
And how much
again,
work you had to put in, Dieter, to get this additional savings?
nothing, right?
Often.
That is the beauty, because I did manage manual approaches before, right? And for the manual approaches, we have weekly meetings. We look at that savings plan utilization, RI utilization, RI coverage, right? And then RI coverage for certain corner cases. We called them blind spots, right? Because in human resources, right, when it comes to interacting correctly with people, right, and you have some biases, right? These biases are called blind spots. So that's the term that we used. That there was a workload that had something like 4, 5, 6 VMs, right? And it had no RI coverage for 9 months, right? And that was a blind spot, because the technician that came to work on a daily basis, right? They go by the highest dollar amount
Yep.
on top, right? And they apply the changes until they run out of time and they need to switch to another customer, right? So that workload with like 5 VMs didn't get any RI coverage in 9+ months, right? So these automated systems are beautiful, right? They all have user interfaces with graphical representations that are very useful, right? And they help you understand how that system is performing, right? You can also measure it yourself, right? But all these vendors have screens that help you track KPIs.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dieter, again for your time. Really
Of
appreciate it.
course,
And thanks for being so gracious to share your thoughts.
of course,
Thank you.
anytime. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You guys take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.